Alright, so in an effort to try to make sure that we have plenty of time to review in class, I want to at least have 2 days, if not 3 days, to review in class. We need to go ahead and get Reconstruction kind of figured out and covered. So we're going to do that through a video that you're watching this weekend. So, alright, so the first thing we got to do is we got to take a look at why Reconstruction. The Civil War is over, but there's a lot of questions left in its path. We got some problems to do. One of the problems is that we have a devastated South. Not only the physical devastation that you see in this picture, which is a picture of Richmond, Virginia. Atlanta looks exactly like this. Physical destruction of property, but we have other losses as well, economic impacts of that. We have to completely redo the southern agricultural system without slavery now. So what is that going to look like? How is that going to be reformed? Other things we have is people, even on the agricultural, at least for the eastern fields, our fields around Gettysburg, for instance, there's mass graves. Now the Union Army, their soldiers have been reinterred into individual graves in a cemetery, but the Confederates are still lying in mass graves in a lot of these battlefields, and they're not dug that deep. So the farmers are not going to want to plow up those fields for fear that they're going to disturb those graves. So we've got to figure out how we're going to reinter those people. How are we going to physically put our agriculture back together as well? So the quick key questions we're dealing with is how are we bringing the South back into Union? What is that going to look like? Is it going to be a punishing Reconstruction, or is it going to be very lenient on the South? How are we going to rebuild the South's economy after its destruction during the war? How are we going to integrate and protect these newly emancipated black freedmen? Slavery, technically when we start Reconstruction, slavery is not completely dead. Remember, we got the border states, Tennessee, areas of Louisiana. Is it going to be completely free now? And if it's completely free for everybody, how are we doing it? How are we setting these people up for economic independence? Because it's great that they're not slaves anymore, but that puts all of this responsibility on their shoulders, and their skills as far as being able to succeed independently are in question. Right? So we've got to figure out how we're going to support that transition. And then also, what branch of government is going to be answering these questions? Is it going to be the executive branch, or is it going to be the Congress? Excuse me. So during wartime, this is pretty simple. Lincoln's got a little bit more authority because it is during wartime. We want the president to have a little bit more of a freer hand to do what needs to be done to help win the war and help bring the country together. So the second inaugural, remember this is about a month before the war is over. He's looking forward to Reconstruction. He says we're going to have a Reconstruction with malice or hatred towards none, with charity for the right for all, firmness in the right. But the big thing here is with malice towards none, so he's not looking to punish the South, and he's trying to get them back into the Union. Or actually, in his mind, they never left the Union. He's just trying to get them their representation back as quickly as possible. So to do that, he's going to have a 10% plan, in which 10% of the eligible voters of the South have to sign a loyalty oath saying that they will not work against the government of the United States. Once 10% of the voting population of those states sign, they can start the process of getting their representatives, their senators. They can run officials for the President of the United States. They can become full states again. Right now they're being treated as territories. Very few rights, very little self-determination. So in 1864, there's going to be 3 states that basically take him up on this plan: Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. However, Congress is a little bit concerned about this. They think it's going to let them off the hook. I'm trying to remember who actually says it, but there's a quote from the Reconstruction time period where a northern congressman says, if I'm being attacked by someone, am I going to, after I have arrested this man, then give him the knife back so he can put it at my throat once again? So people are concerned that the South is going to rebel again if they are not taught a lesson about the Civil War. So the Wade-Davis bill is actually going to require Southerners to have 50% loyalty oaths, and these are going to be ironclad oaths in which they say they never, not only are they never going to attack the Union again, but that they had never voluntarily done so. Maybe they were conscripted or something like that. They had never voluntarily done so. And really what this is going to do is it's going to stretch the time period that the South is without representation in Congress, so that they cannot be in control of some of these issues as far as the rights of African Americans after the Civil War, and can't push these divisive politics anymore until they've kind of learned their lesson. So this is what Congress wants, and these are radical Republicans in the House and Senate. The Wade-Davis bill is going to be passed. It goes to Lincoln's desk to be signed. Lincoln does not want to sign it, but he's also conflicted about vetoing it as well. Remember, vetoes are pretty hard to justify using because you're going against the perceived will of the people. But in this case, Lincoln doesn't have to do so. Congress is out of session, so all he has to do is just hold on to this bill for 10 days without signing it. If he doesn't sign it and Congress isn't back in session, it's pocket vetoed, meaning that the Wade-Davis bill is killed, and to pass it, basically Congress has to go through the entire thing again. Alright, so Lincoln is going to be assassinated. We've already mentioned, we should have mentioned that in class already, or known. 13th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1865. Is basically, let's just finish this thing out. So even in the border states, even in Tennessee and Louisiana, and those coastal regions where the Union Army had control in 1863, this is going to be the end all of it. No slavery or involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. This is a controversial thing today. There are a lot of documentaries getting talked about how our prison system is taking over and using unfree labor or unpaid labor. Right? And the controversies surrounding that, especially when you have for-profit prisons. Carpetbaggers are going to be controversial. These are going to be former abolitionists who are now moving to the South. They're going to be called carpetbaggers because they're bringing luggage that looks like this, right, made out of carpet. Right? And a lot of them are basically buying up old plantations. So if you think about economic straits of a plantation owner after the Civil War, possibly some devastation to their land. 2, they don't know what the cotton market is going to do. 3, they're staring down having to pay out a lot of money for labor just to bring this cotton in. So their margins have gotten thinner and thinner and thinner. They're just trying to sell the farm and get whatever money that they can. So some of them are going to sell. Sometimes these northern abolitionists are going to buy up that land. And it's perceived as making money off the misfortune of the South. However, some of these carpetbaggers are actually trying to help Southern freedmen with the Freedmen's Bureau and education and those types of things. So the Southerners, carpetbaggers, are definitely a negative connotation. The Northerners are seen as helping the freedmen out. And again, there's a lot of racism even in the North at the time. So these carpetbaggers don't represent a majority of the population of the North, but they are trying to help this transition. The Southern Republicans are going to get the name scallywags, that they are low down, dirty, underneath a snake's belly because they are helping the enemy in their occupation. So North Carolina's governor is going to be W.W. Holden. Later, he will be impeached by Southern Democrats when they regain control of the state house and state legislature. This alliance between Southern farmers and the Republican Party is going to end in 1877, which is also the end of Reconstruction. One of the things put in place early on in this Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau, basically giving, we would kind of call this welfare today, providing food, clothing, medical care, and education to newly freed men, emancipated African Americans in the South. However, it is going to be open up to poor whites as well. However, think about racial attitudes. Not a lot of poor whites are going to take advantage of this either because of the racial connotations there. It is going to be abandoned in 1872 before Reconstruction completely ends, and the next couple of slides reflect why. Even in the North, it's going to be perceived as giving former slaves plenty to eat and nothing to do. They're not working, and they're just getting free stuff from the government. You can kind of see how that morphs into some racist stereotypes as well. So once Lincoln has been assassinated, it falls to his vice president to carry on Reconstruction. In this case is Andrew Johnson, who's an interesting man in this position. Remember, back up here with presidential Reconstruction, there was some resistance to Lincoln's plan, but it is not completely out there. Not everybody in Congress is against Lincoln's plan. Again, he has some political weight to him. Right? Nobody questions his loyalty. Andrew Johnson, though, was a Democrat. So we have a Democrat vice president in a Republican administration. What had actually happened during the Civil War is that the Democrat Party and the Republican Party in the North fused in a unity party to fight this war. And also Lincoln is looking past into the era of Reconstruction and knowing the South is going to be complaining that they don't have representation in Congress. So he wants to give them some voice in government, even if it's just the vice presidency. So he looks for somebody who's, one, committed to the Union, but two, going to be a Southerner. He picks Andrew Johnson. He's a white supremacist, so he's not got any feelings of equality for African Americans, but he's even more upset with the slave aristocracy in the South, and that's who he really believes that they were fighting. So Johnson's plan really carries over a lot of what Lincoln wanted, a 10% plus, but it's going to offer amnesty upon a simple oath, except for the higher-up Confederate leaders. New constitutions, only minimum requirements are going to be needed, repudiating slavery, saying that slavery is dead, that they'll never secede again, and that state debts are still going to be owed to the federal government. And provisional governors in the Confederate States are going to call to oversee elections for constitutional conventions to make these changes. But the effects is that it's going to disenfranchise certain leading Confederates, so people with experience and know how to run the government, people that had been involved in the Senate and House of Representatives before. And it's going to pardon a lot of that planter elite, the people that supposedly Johnson was upset with. And these people are going to be in charge of the South after the war. So the question is going to be, how much have they changed? Are they still got these disloyal attitudes? So Northerners were really upset about that. Right? Many Southern states are going to fall short of a lot of those minimum requirements, especially on the states' rights issues. Johnson is going to be giving out so many pardons that it looks like he's just allowing everybody to go free. And then black codes are going to be put in place. It's going to raise that question, is slavery dead? Because these black codes, what they're meant to do is guarantee that African Americans are going to stay on the plantations and work for their former slave owners for basically no wage. Right? They'll get wages, but it's basically just to allow them to live the next year, and then the money runs out and they have to go back to the same person for employment again. So sharecropping develops. What sharecropping is basically, right, before you had all the slaves are in their quarters together, they're being forced to work by the plantation owner, has complete control over what happens on his land. Afterwards, the sharecropping system is a contract between the former slave owner and his workers now, his tenants, his sharecroppers. They are going to be allowed to grow crops on his land, but he has complete control over what they grow. You must plant this much cotton, this much tobacco, this much is for your food plot. But at the end of the year, he essentially gets to sell this crop, and he's basically going to get a king's ransom of the crop for owning the land. And the sharecropper is going to get maybe 10, 15, possibly 20% of the crop to sell, which is going to allow them to buy food and buy everything they need for the next year, but it's not going to allow them to save up, move up, get land of their own. Also, any implements, any things that the owner of the land needs done, the sharecroppers have to do. Anything that they have to buy as far as plows, or buying from the landowner and having to pay him for those things. So you can see how this is a very restrictive enterprise. Tenant farming is going to be very similar to that, except you're paying rent, but the rent is very high, so in effect it's doing the same thing. Keeping African Americans on the same plantations that they were on before the war, working for little to no wage, not allowing them to advance socially, not allowing them to get their own land, and making sure they're still indebted to the plantation owner. And this is where the pink areas are where sharecropping is going to be significantly used. And that follows the same black belt, plantation belt, cotton belt of the South. And also remember that the sharecropping system is also going to have a lot of poor whites in it as well. You're also going to have this tension here between former slaves and their slave owners, especially ones that have gone to the north. And what this letter is basically this slave, Jordan Anderson, Jordan Anderson, is a slave that has made his way into, I believe it's Ohio? Yeah, Dayton, Ohio. And his former owner is asking him to come back to the plantation and work for him. And basically he goes through it and says, hey, we're doing here pretty good here in Ohio. We would love to come back and work for you. However, you owe us back pay for all those years, the 23 years that I was in your employment and you never paid me. Deduct whatever you gave us, whatever you paid for our clothes and for our food and for our medical treatment, and then if you give that to us, we may come back. If you don't pay us that, we have no, there's no, what's the word I'm looking for? There's no hope that we're coming back because we can't trust you. We can't trust that you're going to treat us fairly or compensate us for our work. All right, so Congress is going to butt heads with Andrew Johnson. Again, they don't trust him because he's a Southern Democrat. And Congress is going to bar Southern congressional delegates. Johnson is going to veto the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866. We know that it gets put into place because it's around until 1872. He's going to veto it. He's also going to veto the Civil Rights Act, which is going to protect the rights of African Americans in the South. And Congress is going to pass these bills over his veto. The first time Congress had overridden a veto in their history. Going back to Andrew Jackson, he vetoed the National Bank, and they weren't able to override it, so the National Bank went the way of the dodo. Here, they override it, increasing tension with Johnson. They think the shots have been fired, they think he understands it. Now, radical Republicans, ones that are firebrand abolitionists, are now in control of Congress. So their leaders are going to be in the Senate. Charles Sumner, he's the guy that got beat up on the congressional floor, and then Thaddeus Stevens in the House. And they're really committed to getting rights for African Americans, former slaves. Not everybody in the North is. Again, this is a radical branch of the Republican Party. But they push a few amendments, the 14th Amendment, which is going to guarantee citizenship by birth, not by race. So if you're born in America, you are an American citizen and equally protected. The states can't pass laws that will endanger your rights. One of those rights is if you have citizenship, and at this time you are a age of majority and you're male, you should be able to vote. But Congress is going to have to spell that out again in another one. Right, the balance of power in Congress, the reason why this is going to be important with voting rights is, especially take a look at South Carolina and Mississippi. Freedmen are going to outnumber white citizens. So they possibly could dominate the political spectrum in South Carolina and in Mississippi especially. They're on equal terms in Louisiana, close to equal terms in Georgia, a little bit less in Alabama, Virginia's less, and about 1/3 of the population of North Carolina. They're still going to have a large voting bloc, especially former U.S. colored troops who are going to be veterans. So 1866 midterm election, Johnson is going to try to get propaganda around the country to get him in a higher power than Congress, but the Republicans are going to win a 3-1 majority in both houses, and they're in control of Reconstruction now. For this radical plan, though, they're going to need some help because, again, these are radical things with enfranchising African Americans. They're going to have to make sure the South is complying. To do that, they're going to put in control the military to be in control of the southern states for a while. And another one of those is the Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act, there was a lot of tension between Johnson and Lincoln's cabinet. And he wanted to fire some people, especially Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. But Congress is going to pass the Tenure of Office Act, which basically says if you needed Senate's confirmation to get your job, the Senate has to fire you. They have to have a say in your firing. The question is going to be on constitutionality of this. So Johnson goes ahead and fires Stanton. He's going to replace a lot of the generals that were involved in radical Reconstruction. So the House is going to impeach him for violating the Tenure of Office Act. It's not like his violation of a law is basically knocking off a bank or killing somebody. He is violating the Tenure of Office Act, violating that law. So they impeach him. The House impeached him 126-47. When it went to the Senate trial, though, he is going to save his job by one vote. One vote short of the 2/3 required vote to kick him out of office. But after this, it's not that long until the next election, and two, Johnson knows that if he resists Congress anymore, he's basically done. So 1868 election, definitely Johnson's not going to be around. It's going to be U.S. Grant, the hero of the Civil War, versus Seymour. And this is going to be called the bloody shirt election, waving the bloody shirt. Some southern states are now back in the Union, and the rallying cry is vote as you shot. So if you were a southerner, you're going to vote for the Democratic Party, and if you're a northerner, you're rallying around that Republican Party. So the 1868 presidential election, you got a popular vote that's pretty split here. Unreconstructed states here in the green, so most of the South is back in. Grant is going to get the electoral vote, even though it's closer in the popular vote. So Grant becomes the president. However, he's a military guy. He doesn't have a whole lot of political experience, and he's relying on other people's knowledge. They're going to take advantage of that. Remember, there's a lot of buddy-buddiness, especially in the military ranks with him during the Civil War. So there's going to be a few different scandals. One, the Credit Mobilier scandal is basically stealing money from the government when they're constructing the Transcontinental Railroad. The whiskey ring is about taxes on whiskey being siphoned off the top by some people, and the Indian ring is about the administration of reservations out in the West and basically stealing money, from that pot. So Grant is seen as being a good guy, but a little bit naive as president and trusting some of his subordinates a little bit too much, and it's their corruption that brings his reputation down, but not enough to prevent him from having a second administration. Crop lien system, tenant farmers, basically all this says the same thing. Keeping African Americans in a subordinate position economically so they can't build wealth. All right, so black and white political participation. Take a look at South Carolina, 61% black members in their legislature. Louisiana, it's 50-50. It's interesting with Mississippi and Alabama, those numbers should be higher, but what's happening is African Americans are going to be disfranchised and intimidated from going to the polls. Hiram Revels is going to be your first African American senator. He's from Mississippi. He's taken Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States' old seat. This is a little bit out of date. There should be at least six African American senators. At least six. But he's taken Jefferson Davis's place. And this is your first African American Senate and House delegates. This is to the national level. But you can imagine what's going to happen after Jim Crow. That's not going to be seen until the 1970s and 80s. Core voters are going to be black veterans. In fact, some of the cemeteries that are built, especially in Beaufort, South Carolina, are built on the way to where the polls are. So people were reminded of the sacrifice that they had to go through to get this vote and make them more loyal voters, especially to the Republican Party. Blacks could register and vote since 1867 in states, and the 15th Amendment is going to guarantee federal voting to, again, make sure that they're allowed to vote. However, so southern states couldn't ban you from voting based on who you were, but they could pass other laws restricting who could vote. So they're going to have literacy tests where you had to read something and tell what's going on. And this is going to be very complicated text. Also, they're going to have grandfather clauses, that the only way that you can vote is if your grandfather had voted. So with these newly emancipated slaves, their grandfathers were slaves and couldn't vote, so they could. The KKK is going to rise up in an effort to stop all this change by Reconstruction. At first, there was this whole idea that they're playing practical jokes, but then the violence starts. Nathan Bedford Forrest is going to be the first imperial wizard of the KKK. He's out in Tennessee trying to resist Reconstruction there. There is an army of the KKK that is created during the Reconstruction time, but it's going to fall apart rather quickly. But to deal with this KKK issue of basically terrorism in the South against African Americans and against those carpetbaggers, the people from the North helping out with Reconstruction, the Congress is going to have to put things in place. The Enforcement Act, basically known as the KKK Act, giving the military authority to try to run down the KKK. It was hard to break them up because a lot of members of the KKK were also members of the local government and were protected by the local government. We're also going to start this idea of the lost cause, a kind of a romantic view of the Civil War, and you're going to have redeemers trying to gain back control of the South. Remember, since 1865, the South has basically become a colony, and all of their laws are being dictated from the federal government. So they want to redeem, they want to get back in control and try to retake and then have a voice in this government again. So the Civil Rights Act of 1875, it's going to be a crime for anybody to deny full and equal use of public places based on their race, prohibited discrimination, and jury selection. The only issue is that there's really hard way to enforce this. So you're going to have Jim Crow laws that are going to be against the Civil Rights Act of 1875, but there's no way to stop them from actually happening. So we're going to abandon Reconstruction in the 1870s. Again, we're trying to rebuild the South. Economically, it's back on a good footing. We've got them back into Congress, but some of these goals about rights for African Americans are going to be left unfulfilled. We'll take a look at why. The support for Reconstruction is going to start to wane. A lot of it is because a lot of money is going missing. People are blaming the Grant administration. There's a depression that happens, so there's less money to waste. There's going to be a concern that we now need to direct our attention to the West and start to spread and make sure we gain the rest of that territory and deal with the Indian problems out there. There's also all this fiat money, this money that's not backed by gold or silver, and the concern is that it may be doing some weird things with our economy, so we've got to try to get those back. But so should we allow war bonds, these many loans that we've gotten from the Civil War, should we allow people to pay them back with greenbacks whose value fluctuates pretty quickly? Other people are going to be upset about African American participation in politics, thinking that they are not equals, and this is both in the North and South. The election of 1872, spoilsmen, those grantist people who are corrupt, versus reformers and the people coming in to change the society. There's rumors of, again, corruption during Grant's administration. Horace Greeley runs as a Democrat. And Greeley is going to be attacked as being a little bit crazy. He's going to die basically right around the election. But you have a very divided political climate. Grant thrives in that. Take a look at the electoral vote, 81%. Popular vote is a little bit less for that. Greeley had some support, but it's widespread, but it's not enough widespread. So Grant becomes president again. He gets the second term. This leads up to the 1876 election. We're still suffering in economic issues from that panic 1876. There's still ideas of corruption. We're still focusing on the West. In 1876, there's this opportunity for the South. There is a Republican running for president, Rutherford B. Hayes, running against Samuel Tilden, who's going to be the Democratic nominee. The South, again, now, since a lot of those laws have been passed to disfranchise African Americans, it's going to be solidly Democratic again. All right, so it's Hayes versus Tilden. In the end, with this election, and this is basically the two supposed voting bases, the Southern Republican base of freedmen, and then in the North, the Democratic base in the North is going to be Irish immigrants. So they're both kind of seen as subhuman by this person, Thomas Nast, who's going to be the political commentator there. And this is how the election of 1876 goes. Again, in South Carolina and Louisiana, still a lot of African Americans voting there, so they're turned Republican. It all comes down to Florida. Florida is going to only have 4 votes, but if you take a look at it, that's going to be enough. Now, on this, it shows Florida as being for the Republican Party. In fact, the votes are trending more towards Tilden and would give Tilden the presidency. But it's so close, it gives an opportunity for compromise. And the big thing here is going to be, what do the Republicans want and what do the Democrats want? The Republicans want the presidency. The Democrats just want an end to Reconstruction. Now, if that's through a Democratic president or whether it's through a Republican president, they really don't care. So what's going to happen is Florida changes its vote through the Electoral College to the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. So Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president. Right, so the Democrats are going to allow Republican Hayes to become president through that Electoral College. Florida changes its vote. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president by 1 electoral vote, but he does so in pledging to withdraw all troops from the South, basically ending Reconstruction. A lot of those radical Republican views can only be enforced through the military, and now that the Army in Blue is leaving the South, the Army in White Sheets comes out, and you have the birth of Jim Crow South. So there's a lot of things left unanswered by this Reconstruction. African American rights are not solidified and protected. We've got economic issues coming out of Reconstruction. We're now focusing more on the West. We've had our first big deal of government corruption under the Grant administration. But the South is back in, and now they have some political clout again through this Democratic Party. Excuse me, they were within a hair's breadth of the presidency in 1877. So they are now back to a political power broker once more. Alright, so we're going to get this review done over the next few days and get you onto your midterm test, and then we'll hit it hard back in January as far as what we're doing out in the West and creating a truly urbanized modern America.